Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for your time, sir. I might get emotional when I do this. Forgive me if I do. But
understandable.
Who is buying poor people out there?
So there are different categories of slaves. So there's a very big problem. So the International Labour Organization and an NGO called Walk Free estimate there are 40 million slaves in the world. Now it's important to emphasize that these are estimates. No one really knows the true number of slaves in the world. But of those 40 million, 15 million or so of those are people in forced marriages, which is a problem globally, including here in South Africa, as you know. And then 25 million odd are economic slaves. And this is a problem all over the world. It's not confined to single geographies. When we're talking about absolute numbers, these are often the most slaves in the world are in Asia. And various economic actors, terrorist organizations, organized criminal gangs, engage in the slave trade. So it's a very serious problem and a big source of income for some organized criminal groups.
Now, this particular problem was brought to light following the CNN exclusive, if you will. And for us, I guess, from an African perspective, it's close to home. You know, when you think about Libya, when you think about Tunisia, the two countries recently went through revolutions, if you will. Their state of governance is not where it used to be. Is this part of the problem why people use those kinds of fractured states, if you will, to push through this kind of trade?
That's absolutely part of the problem. As you can imagine, when a state collapses like it did, although some order has returned to Libya, there's a power vacuum, and that creates opportunities for both criminal gangs and terrorist organizations, and these often bleed into each other. I think not a lot of people know this, but the Taliban, who we all know from Afghanistan, makes a huge amount of money from heroin. They produced the poppy, and they make huge profits from the illegal sale of heroin. And so there's linkages and interlinkages between different types of actors, and absolutely they target vulnerable countries. That having been said, even in advanced countries there are slaves. So I can't mention specifics, but there's an anecdote where Thomson Reuters got involved, where in an advanced Western country in Europe, we have researchers who study this problem. They study financial crime, but also human trafficking. And two of our researchers identified a human trafficker who was then identified in this Western country. And a particular bank, a large financial institution in that country, alerted the police, and they actually freed 16 slaves on the back of these two researchers working for Thomson Reuters, having identified this human trafficker. And this was in an advanced first world country. So it is a global problem.
I wanted to ask you that because, like in any business, margins are important. I mean, I read stories that people are being sold. These poor West African people are being sold for as little as $400. How are you even making a profit? How is this even a sustainable business? How do you get these people to be able to sell them for as low as 400 rands?
So what is happening in the Libyan case, it's very closely connected to the European migration crisis. So as you know, in the last couple of years, there's been an immense tragedy in the Mediterranean of a large number of Africans trying to immigrate to Europe. And criminal gangs and human smugglers and so on have all been involved. So there's a lot of people are attracted to North African states like Libya, where they become vulnerable to being exploited in various ways, including by criminal gangs who capture them and then sell them as slaves. Typically, slaves are used in primary commodity production. So when we're talking about the economic slaves, coca, bricks, slate, shrimp is a big problem in Asia, for example. There are a lot of people who are stuck out on boats, including here in Africa and Ghana, Lake Volta. There are an estimated 7,000 to 10,000 slaves on Lake Volta. And these children often are held against their will, sold to slaves, sometimes tragically by their parents, and they're forced to work in extremely dangerous conditions, and many of them can't swim. So you can only imagine the horror stories that come out of that. But as I said, it happens everywhere, and it is an immensely profitable enterprise. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations, estimates $150 billion of profits annually made through either slavery or human trafficking. So it's a low-risk, high-profit, high-margin business, unfortunately.
Now, when you look at the slavery issue in totality, people move because they're looking for better opportunities. That's why they leave their countries. So there's a sense of responsibility that African governments must be stronger, economies must be stronger, but also people should have the right to seek greener pastures. What's the role of governments, and what can Africa do to protect itself here?
Absolutely. So a lot of the people attracted by Europe are attracted to economic opportunity. So an obvious response, it's obvious but it's very difficult to execute against, of course, is to create opportunities for those people at home. That's very easy to say and extremely hard to do, but that is definitely one of the things that needs to be done. But so we saw Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, saying in the last couple of days that there needs to be a legal immigration program into Europe for planned migration of people seeking opportunities. And of course, Europe in some ways needs young people to come into their countries and invigorate their economies in many ways. So there are many potential avenues that African governments can take, including putting pressure on governments all over the world to do more, and the UN. And there's a lot the private sector needs to do to disrupt slavery.
Michael, I think for me, one of the things that I do not understand is how this is so, I mean, the pictures have been horrific, right? And I think that it has not been met with the same kind of international focus. People are talking about Trump and his tweets, not this particular problem. How do we put this on the world stage? How do we make it, I mean, slavery is deplorable. It shouldn't be something we speak about. It's like, I don't even know where to begin. How do we bring it back to the world stage to get the attention that it deserves in order to eradicate this thing? Because that has to do with strengthening governments in Libya, in Tunisia, and all the other places that are vulnerable to that.
So absolutely, and the even more depressing statistic is the estimate is that there is today more slaves in the world than there ever have been. So it's not a problem that has gone away. So a key component of combating slavery is to raise awareness. And there are also new laws in place. For example, the UK has passed the Modern Slavery Act to prevent slaves being used in supply chains. So that is a fundamental. So we need to denounce, we need to disrupt, and we need to use data to combat this problem. Okay.
Michael, we saw Emmanuel Macron on his visit to Africa. He says he echoes the same sentiments of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. This is one of the three biggest stains on humanity. He spoke about sanctions, sanctioning a country like Libya or Tunisia. Would that help or hinder in the great debate? I mean, I don't see how sanctions will help, but what do you make of it?
So I don't have an opinion on sanctioning countries. What definitely will help is sanctioning individuals and identifying individuals who are guilty of these crimes and sanctioning them through the UN. So that is one of the resolutions that has been taken by the International Labour Organization. There was the Buenos Aires declaration a couple of weeks ago with a plan of action to combat both a related problem of what's called child labour and human slavery. And one of the mechanisms, the UN has a list of people or entities that are sanctioned by the UN, and countries all over the world are obliged by law. South Africa has indigenized this law in the FICA Act, for example. And they can use those mechanisms to say these individuals, these entities, and so on are involved in the slave trade. And that is one of the big things Thomson Reuters does. We work with NGOs, Liberty Asia being a big one, to identify who the slavers are, who the slave traders are. Then we let our clients know in the financial institutions. We cut them off from the global financial system, and also let companies know who might inadvertently have this in their supply chain. No one is saying that a big corporate is buying directly from a company employing slaves, but it becomes complicated because a supplier of a supplier of a supplier of a supplier might have a slave. And that is where data becomes extremely important.
ECOWAS came out with a statement saying that it finds it difficult to work with the authorities in Libya because they cannot get any authorized person to report to them. And they're saying, Libya that is saying that it's starting investigations. Do you have hope?
One has to hope. I think there is a lot of action being taken, concrete action, and like we're doing now, we're raising awareness about this problem, which I think is the first step, identifying it. And I tell clients and audiences all over Africa this, and many people react with shock. They're slaves in the 21st century, and they're incredulous. So getting the news out there that this is in fact a problem, and that every supply chain professional, every compliance professional, every private country in the entire world needs to know this and pay attention to this and do due diligence on their suppliers. And every government needs to pass laws, and every law enforcement agency needs to take action to identify the criminal gangs engaging in this behavior.
That was Michael Meadon from Thomson Reuters.